His name is David. He is 43 years old and he farms yam and cassava on 2 plots of land in Guma Local Government Area, Benue State. He has been farming this land since he inherited it from his father. His grandfather farmed the same land. The soil is good, the rains are reliable in season. In a normal year, David sells enough to pay his children's school fees and keep the family through the dry months. 2025 was not a normal year. In June 2025, coordinated attacks swept through communities in Guma, his own local government area. According to multiple news reports, over 200 people were killed across coordinated attacks in Benue State that month. David did not lose his life, but he lost access to his farm. The path to it passes through areas where neighbors have been killed and others have fled. He has not planted this season. He is living on what the church community is sharing and on the small remittances his eldest son sends from Makodi. David does not describe what happened as a land dispute. In the language of Benue civil society and the Tiv traditional institution, he describes it as an invasion. The Tiv, the paramount ruler of the Tiv ethnic nation, publicly described the attacks as, in his words, a full-scale genocidal invasion and land-grabbing campaign rather than a mere communal dispute. What is happening to David is really about the most explosive, most undercovered political story heading into 2027 election. The Middle Belt farmer-herder violence is not a localized security problem that can be managed with press releases and military deployments. It is a political crisis, a question of land, identity, survival, and governance failure that is building into a 2027 electoral flashpoint with consequences nobody in the national political conversation is taking seriously enough. The question is, what does the Middle Belt's silent, accumulating tension mean for who wins the 2027 presidential election? And why is nobody who wants to win it speaking about it with the specificity the communities themselves are demanding? Before we go deeper, I just want to say thank you. Since NaijaNewsWatch started, the support, the comments, the likes, and every single subscription have helped this channel grow beyond what I imagined. If you have been enjoying these in-depth political breakdowns and you want to see more videos like this, the best way to support the channel is by subscribing. It really motivates me to keep researching, digging deeper, and bringing you clear, fact-based analysis. Now let us get into the story, because what happens next changes everything. Let us set the foundation, because the Middle Belt security crisis has a specific, documented escalation pattern that national political coverage has consistently underreported. On June 13, 2025, a silent crisis escalated in Nigeria's Middle Belt. In coordinated attacks across communities in Benue State, over 200 people lost their lives. The response was tepid. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu issued a statement only after Pope Leo XIV publicly prayed for the victims. The Nigerian president's framing of the violence as a herder-farmer clash was fiercely rejected by local leaders. The most significant criticism came from Tiv, Professor James Otese Ayatse, the chairman of the Benue State Traditional Rulers Council, who also serves as the paramount ruler of the Tiv ethnic nation. In his speech addressing the Nigerian president, he referred to the violence as a full-scale genocidal invasion and land-grabbing campaign rather than a mere communal dispute. Between 2023 and May 2025, over 6,800 people have been murdered in Benue State, while over 500,000 residents have been displaced, according to conflict tracking data. In Plateau, more than 1,100 deaths have been recorded since 2021. Renewed attacks in 2026 in Agatu, Gwe West, and Guma local government areas suggest that officials have yet to reach a lasting solution. Intercommunal violence has sharply risen in north-central Plateau and Benue states since 2025, while intercommunal tensions have also newly emerged in Kwara State. This is not background violence. This is a crisis that has killed thousands, displaced hundreds of thousands, and continues in 2026. And yet it has generated almost no sustained presidential campaign engagement from any major 2027 candidate. The question that makes this story politically urgent right now is the same one David is sitting with in his temporary displacement. Why is the scale and the trajectory of this crisis not at the center of the 2027 presidential conversation? Now let us look at the constitutional and institutional framework, because to understand the Middle Belt's political significance, you need to understand the specific governance responsibilities that are failing. The Nigerian Constitution's Section 14, subsection 2b, states that the security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government. This provision places the fundamental responsibility for protecting citizens against armed violence on the state, primarily the federal government through the armed forces and the Nigeria Police Force. According to the next year report published in February 2026, authorities are urged to move beyond reactive security deployment, instead to reform land governance, strengthen rural policing, disrupt illicit funding networks, and establish inclusive peace committees. Without structural reforms, the conflict risks becoming a permanent feature of Nigeria's rural landscape. The specific governance failure the report identifies is not military capacity, it is policy design. Reactive security deployment, sending soldiers after attacks have already killed hundreds, does not address the structural drivers of the conflict. According to the report, those structural drivers include historical land disputes, weak governance, climate pressures, and the growing criminalization of rural conflict. Once governed by seasonal cooperation between farmers and pastoralists, competition over land and water has intensified amid population growth, erratic rainfall, and the southward movement of herders from drought-affected northern areas. The economic cost is documented and significant. Nigeria is estimated to have lost USD $13.7 billion between 2016 and 2018 from farmer-herder conflicts. Benue State alone incurred losses exceeding 400 billion naira from property destruction and disrupted agricultural production. The Middle Belt is, as it is called, the food basket of Nigeria. When farmers cannot farm, Nigeria's food security deteriorates. When food security deteriorates, food prices rise for every Nigerian, including the urban voters who are making presidential choices based on the cost of rice. The Electoral Act and INEC's operational framework create a specific governance challenge in security-affected states. INEC cannot conduct elections in communities that are under active armed threat or mass displacement. If the Middle Belt security situation deteriorates further before February 2027, INEC will face operational decisions about which communities can safely participate in the election. Voter suppression through insecurity is not always deliberate. Sometimes it is the natural consequence of a security crisis that the government has failed to contain. Now let us go deep, because the Middle Belt silence in the 2027 political conversation is not accidental. It is the product of specific political calculations by every major candidate, and those calculations are worth examining precisely. Let us start with the most important political fact about the Middle Belt crisis that is consistently understated in national coverage. These incidents are often explained away as local clashes, but victims across the region increasingly describe them as systematic assaults on indigenous Christian farming communities. The framing dispute, herder-farmer clash versus genocidal invasion and land-grabbing campaign, is not only a humanitarian question, it is a political one. The federal government's consistent use of the herder-farmer clash framing has a specific political effect. It implies that both sides are equally culpable. It avoids naming specific armed groups, and it frames the crisis as a land management problem rather than a security and sovereignty failure. The traditional rulers' rejection of that framing, culminating in the Tortive's June 2025 public statement directly challenging the federal government security narrative that has occurred in the democratic era. Now, here is the pattern interrupt that reframes everything about the Middle Belt's political significance in 2027. In 2023, Peter Obi won Plateau and Nasarawa states in the presidential election, two of the states most affected by farmer-herder violence, in results that no pre-election model predicted. According to political analysts, the Middle Belt Christian community's response to the Muslim-Muslim ticket was a significant driver of that result. Communities that felt the federal government did not see them, did not protect them, and did not even name what was happening to them accurately, those communities voted for the candidate whose ticket at least did not carry the religious symbolism they associated with their attackers. In 2027, the conditions that produced those results are more extreme, not less. The then Nigerian Chief of Defense Staff, General Christopher Gwabin Musa, during a press briefing, suggested that land disputes, indiscriminate cattle grazing, and animal rearing are the main causes of the Benue killings. Many Nigerians share these sentiments and attribute the massacres to a land grab campaign disguised as a religious conflict. The framing battle, which the federal government is losing in Middle Belt communities, is intensifying, and intensifying community grievance against the federal government's handling of the crisis is a specific political fuel for the opposition preference vote in Benue, Plateau, Nasarawa, and southern Kaduna. Now, let us look at how each major 2027 candidate is navigating or avoiding the Middle Belt crisis. The APC and Tinubu.
According to reporting, Tinubu issued a statement only after Pope Leo XIV publicly prayed for the victims. That timeline, waiting for an international religious leader to act before the Nigerian president responded, was politically damaging in the Middle Belt communities where the tortive is more immediately credible than any federal spokesperson. The APC controls Benue's governorship through Governor Hyacinth Alia. According to reporting, Governor Alia reported that 17 of 23 local government areas in Benue State are under siege, noting that federal intervention is helping to reduce that number. This statement from an APC governor is itself an acknowledgement of the scale of the crisis that the federal government's messaging has been minimizing. Peter Obi and the NDC. Obi's 2023 Middle Belt results, winning Plateau and Nasarawa, were partly produced by the political resonance of his candidacy with Middle Belt Christian communities.
In 2027, he has not yet made any documented specific policy commitments to the Middle Belt security crisis. His governance frugality argument and his Southeast Catholic identity still carry political resonance in these communities, but the specific, named, detailed policy commitment to addressing the structural drivers of Middle Belt violence, land governance reform, rural policing, disruption of illicit arms networks has not been publicly made. Communities that have experienced 6,800 deaths in Benue since 2023 are not primarily motivated by general governance frugality arguments. They are motivated by the specific question, which candidate understands what is happening to us? Atiku and the ADC. Atiku's northern network includes relationships with the communities from which some of the armed groups attacking Middle Belt farming communities are drawn. This creates a specific political sensitivity around the farmer-herder crisis that makes it unlikely his campaign will make the Middle Belt security crisis a campaign centerpiece. His silence on the issue is the most politically constrained silence in the 2027 presidential field. The silent players in this story are the Middle Belt community institutions, the Benue State Traditional Rulers Council under the Tortiv, the Plateau State's Jos-based civil society organizations, the Christian Association of Nigeria chapters in Benue and Plateau, whose political guidance shapes community voting behavior in ways that no campaign press release can replicate. These institutions have already expressed, through the Tortiv's June 2025 statement, a level of political frustration with the federal government that is historically unprecedented. Whether they translate that frustration into specific, public, pre-election political guidance, as they did informally in 2023 through their permissive environments for Obi's candidacy, will determine whether the Middle Belt preference vote activates at scale in 2027. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Let us come back to David in Guma, Benue State. He has not planted this season. He is living on church food sharing and his son's remittances. He is one of the hundreds of thousands of Middle Belt farming community members who are not just politically alienated, they are economically destroyed by a crisis the federal government has not adequately contained. For David, the 2027 election is not primarily a question of which party wins. It is a question of whether any candidate for the Nigerian presidency is willing to say, clearly and publicly, what the Tortiv already said, that what is happening in the Middle Belt is not a herder-farmer clash requiring mediation. It is an armed invasion requiring the same federal security response that would be deployed if any other community in Nigeria was experiencing organized armed attacks at this scale. Surveys show that 43.3% of arable crop farmers in the affected regions earned between Naira 20,000 and 50,000 per month during periods of heightened violence, compared to 38.8% before insecurity escalated. David is one of those farmers. He is not in the statistics as a displaced person. He is in the statistics as a farmer whose income has collapsed because he cannot reach his land safely. The agricultural productivity loss that ACAPS documented, the Naira 400 billion in Benue State alone, is made of individual David-sized losses: farms unplanted, harvests uncollected, debts unpaid, school fees missed. For the broader Nigerian food economy, the Middle Belt agricultural collapse has a national consequence.
Benue State is called the food basket of the nation for a reason. Its yam, cassava, and other staple crops feed markets across Nigeria. When Middle Belt farming communities cannot farm, the supply of those staples decreases. When supply decreases while demand stays constant, food prices rise. The food price inflation that every Nigerian is experiencing is not entirely traceable to any single cause, but the sustained disruption of Middle Belt agricultural production is a documented contributing factor. The international dimension of the Middle Belt crisis is specific, documented, and consequential. Nigeria's president, Bola Tinubu, issued a statement only after Pope Leo XIV prayed for the victims. The Pope described the attack against the predominantly Christian community in Benue State as a terrible massacre. The fact that a papal statement preceded a presidential response to attacks in which over 200 Nigerians died is not a minor diplomatic detail. It is a governance timeline that was noted internationally by U.S. congressional committees that track religious freedom in Nigeria, by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom that already has Nigeria on its watch list, and by the UK Parliamentary Committee on International Human Rights that monitors violence against Christian communities globally. The Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, an international body established to monitor and respond to mass atrocity risks, has Nigeria on its active monitoring list. The armed extremist group Boko Haram launched an insurgency in northern Nigeria, while intercommunal violence has sharply risen in north-central Plateau and Benue states since 2025, while intercommunal tensions have also newly emerged in Kwara State. For Nigerians in the diaspora, particularly those from Middle Belt communities, the crisis is personally felt and politically activating. The Benue diaspora in the UK, the US, and Canada has been among the most vocal international communities documenting the attacks, fundraising for displaced community members, and lobbying host country governments to put Nigeria's Middle Belt situation on the international agenda. Their political energy, which could be directed towards the 2027 presidential campaign in ways that support whatever candidate most credibly commits to Middle Belt security, is currently being expressed primarily through humanitarian documentation rather than partisan political organization. Let me address what people on every side are getting wrong about the Middle Belt crisis and its political implications. The first misconception, from those who reduce the Middle Belt crisis to a simple religious conflict, is that the violence is primarily about Christian-Muslim religious tension. The next year report links the violence to a mix of historical land disputes, weak governance, climate pressures, and the growing criminalization of rural conflict. The religious dimension is real. Most of the targeted farming communities are predominantly Christian, and most of the identified armed groups operate from communities with Muslim identity. But reducing the crisis to religion obscures the structural drivers: climate change pushing herder movement southward, arms proliferation making rural conflicts lethal at unprecedented scale, land governance failure leaving resource disputes without peaceful resolution mechanisms that require governance solutions, not religious dialogue alone. The second misconception from the federal government's consistent framing is that the herder-farmer clash description is adequate for what is happening. The Tortsiev's June 2025 statement directly rejecting this framing is not a partisan political attack. It is the considered public position of the chairman of the Benue State Traditional Rulers Council, the paramount ruler of the Tiv ethnic nation. His description of coordinated attacks across multiple communities as a full-scale genocidal invasion and land-grabbing campaign reflects a specific pattern of violence: night raids, mass killings, village burning, and subsequent land occupation that does not fit the spontaneous clash narrative. The political cost of the federal government's framing is the deepening loss of trust in Middle Belt communities that has been building since 2016. The third misconception from opposition political advocates who see the Middle Belt as simply a OB constituency is that Middle Belt community voting behavior is predictable and locked for any specific opposition candidate. The 2023 results showed strong preference votes for OB. Those results were driven by specific conditions: the Muslim-Muslim ticket, the obedient social media movement's specific resonance in educated urban middle belt communities, and the community-level civil society institutions' permissive political environment. None of those conditions are automatically present in 2027. If the NDC's campaign does not make specific community-level commitments to middle belt security, visiting the communities, naming the structural reforms, committing resources and timeline, the community preference vote may express itself through disengagement rather than through a specific candidate endorsement. Here is what to watch: 3 signals that will tell you whether the middle belt's silent tension is becoming a 2027 electoral force. First signal: whether any 2027 presidential candidate makes a formal, named, policy-specific visit to Benue or Plateau. A candidate who visits Guma in Benue, the epicenter of the June 2025 attacks, and speaks specifically about structural land governance reform, rural policing, and the specific community's characterization of the violence, is a candidate who is taking the middle belt preference vote seriously. A candidate who issues press releases from Abuja while avoiding the specific community realities is a candidate who is not. This signal is observable, public, and meaningful.
Second signal: whether the Benue State Traditional Rulers Council or any middle belt civic institution issues any formal pre-election guidance or statement. The Tortive's June 2025 statement was a governance statement, not an electoral one, but the communities he leads will be making electoral decisions in 2027. If the Traditional Rulers Council or the Christian Association of Nigeria's Benue and Plateau chapters issue any pre-election communications that explicitly or implicitly evaluate the candidates' responses to the Middle Belt crisis, those communications will shape community voting behavior in ways that no campaign message can replicate. Third signal: whether the federal government announces any specific structural policy change, not a military deployment, but a governance reform for the Middle Belt before 2027. A land governance reform announcement, a dedicated rural policing program, a specific NFIU action against the illicit funding networks that sustain criminal armed groups in the region. Any of these would represent a qualitative change in the government's response. Their absence through the 2026 election build-up and into 2027 would confirm that the current government's approach remains reactive and structural reform remains deferred. Communities like David's will notice. Best case scenario: a 2027 presidential candidate, most likely Obi on the NDC platform, given his 2023 Middle Belt results, makes a documented, specific, community visit-based commitment to Middle Belt structural security reform. The Benue and Plateau traditional institutions provide informal political guidance that activates the community preference vote. The security situation does not deteriorate further enough to suppress voter participation in affected areas. The Middle Belt delivers its 2023 preference vote at scale on the NDC platform, contributing to the constitutional spread requirement being met in 3 critical north-central states. Worst-case scenario: no candidate makes a specific community-visited Middle Belt policy commitment. Without structural reforms, the conflict risks becoming a permanent feature of Nigeria's rural landscape. Violence continues into 2027. INEC faces operational challenges in conducting elections in communities where displacement continues. Voter participation in affected Middle Belt communities is suppressed, not by deliberate political manipulation, but by the practical impossibility of participation under active insecurity. The Middle Belt preference vote, which in 2023 was one of the most important unexpected electoral forces, is neutralized by the security crisis itself. The long-term political impact if the Middle Belt security crisis remains structurally unaddressed through the 2027 cycle and beyond is the permanent political alienation of a region that is Nigeria's food basket, its religious plurality showpiece, and the site of the most documentable test of whether the Nigerian state can protect its most vulnerable citizens. The conflict has led to the loss of lives and properties, humanitarian crises, food insecurity, and instability in the region. The region has continued to experience a cycle of bloodbath, particularly in Benue and Plateau states. Communities that experience decade-long security crises without adequate government response do not remain politically passive indefinitely. Let us come back to David in Guma, Benue State. He has not planted this season. His farm is inaccessible, his family is managing on church food and his son's remittances. He did not describe what happened in June 2025 as a land dispute. He described it the way his paramount ruler described it, as an invasion. At the beginning of this video, I asked, what does the Middle Belt's silent accumulating tension mean for who wins the 2027 presidential election? And why is nobody who wants to win it speaking about it with the specificity the communities are demanding?
Here's the honest answer to both questions. The Middle Belt tension means that Benue, Plateau, and Nasarawa, which produced some of the most surprising presidential results in 2023, carry the same community grievance into 2027 at an even more intense level. More people killed, more farms abandoned, more communities displaced, more traditional rulers publicly saying that the government's framing of the crisis is not accurate. The political energy for a preference vote against the incumbent handling of this crisis is larger in 2027 than it was in 2023. And nobody who wants to win is speaking about it with specificity because the specific policy commitments the Middle Belt demands, land governance reform that addresses the structural competition for resources, rural policing that is community-embedded rather than reactive, accountability for armed group funding networks, are commitments that require confronting interests and narratives that every candidate is, in different ways, reluctant to directly challenge. My measured conclusion: the Middle Belt's silent tension is the most politically consequential underreported story in the 2027 cycle. Its communities have demonstrated in 2023 that they vote independently in large numbers based on their assessment of which candidate sees them. The candidate who first makes a specific community visit-backed commitment to addressing the structural drivers of Middle Belt violence, naming the reform, naming the community, naming the timeline, will activate the most emotionally intense and organizationally independent voter bloc available to any 2027 opposition campaign. David is waiting to see if anyone does. The question I want to leave you with is this: based on what you now know about what is happening in Benue, Plateau, and Nasarawa, the scale of the deaths, the displacement, the framing battle between the Tortiv and the federal government, which 2027 presidential candidate do you believe has the most credible commitment to the Middle Belt security crisis? And has any of them yet said or done enough to earn those communities' votes? Drop your honest answer in the comments. Before you go, I just want to sincerely thank you for spending your time with NaijaNewsWatch today. Your support means more than you probably realize. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really going on, do me a favor, share it with one person who needs to understand this. Like the video, subscribe to NaijaNewsWatch, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.